2, 1. So, welcome everybody. Welcome back to our Degrowth mini-series of the Future Scientist webinar. For those that are for the first time here, I am Federico Savini, one of the organizers of this series, together with Leo van Kampenhout and Fabian Dablander. And together we put together these 4 meetings about the topic of degrowth. If you were here already, the other meetings, this would sound as a repetition, but let me introduce you briefly to this project. It's a mini series of 4 sessions, 4 webinars that explore the fantastic world of degrowth. We started with a meeting that introduced the topic of degrowth and set it against the idea of green growth by Krelis Rammelt. We followed that lecture with one by Miriam Mesner on the different perspectives that the concept of degrowth opens up. I must say that lecture showed us that it's a bit of a Pandora box. From degrowth, we can talk about all kinds of other subtopics from the commons, labor, justice, north-south relations, etc., etc. The 3rd meeting today will dive deeper into the concrete policies for degrowth. I will introduce it in a second. And the 4th meeting, which will take place the 8th of December, will be a panel with 3 activist policy advocates of degrowth in the Netherlands. And there we will discuss the implication of this term and this agenda for the Netherlands in particular. The meeting of today is about policies. And for this meeting, we invited Nick Fitzpatrick here with us. We invited him because he's one of the co-author of I would say, very, very important and useful paper where they review all the policy proposals that degrowth advances. One of the most common critique, actually, to degrowth is that it's in a utopia and it's difficult to realize. That's usually something that degrowers need to confront all the time. Well, this paper actually showed black and white that it is not true. There are many policy proposals, there are concrete targets, concrete goals that can be taken up by policymakers, activists, civic society. So we would like to know more about it, and I think it would be useful also for progressing the debate of about degrowth in the Netherlands. Nick is a PhD candidate in environment and sustainability at the Nova University of Lisbon in Portugal. He works on the relationship between power, politics, and the practice of degrowth. As far as I understand, he was also a speechwriter for Pope Francis. That was one of the other curious things that I saw in his biography. And I'm very happy to have him here. He's connected from Australia, and that's why we are doing this webinar at this time of the day. And I hope you will enjoy it, perhaps having a bite during your lunch break. Before starting, just the usual communications. First, we are recording this meeting that will be available on the YouTube channel for those who are not connected with us now. And secondly, please post your questions on the Mentimeter link, which is below the video of this session on YouTube. We will collect them and I will post them to Nick at the end of his talk. And Nick, I give you the floor right away. Thank you again for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Federico, and Leo and Fabian for organizing the talk today. Yeah, as Federico mentioned, a lot of my PhD focus surrounds degrowth, and the first part of which was my first paper called Exploring Degrowth Policy Proposals, which I'd like to explain in a bit more detail today in the presentation. But as Federico said, maybe there is some people that have joined the previous webinars and others that haven't. So I will whip over quickly what is degrowth for those that hadn't joined the previous webinars. Just give me one sec to share my presentation. Sweet. So for today's presentation, I'll focus a bit on why we need degrowth. What is degrowth? Where is degrowth research happening? From what authors, what funding foundations, for example? And the last and most important part, how to organize for degrowth. And I've put a little teaser of how to destroy, fix, and co-create on behalf of the degrowth advocates. So why degrowth? As most of us know in the call, we live in ecological overshoot. The global resource use of the people on Earth at the moment is 1.75 times that which the Earth can regenerate in a single year. And we see this with an ever-rising global material footprint, which is the use of energy and resources in a given year from 1970 onwards, and that this continues to climb and climb. And the latest research suggests that the coupling between GDP and material use is quite tight, and we shouldn't rely on absolute decoupling on a global scale, which is the green growth agenda for those not familiar, in order to achieve sustainability and social justice. And this is why we need to reduce our global material footprint, or at least what degrowth advocates would push for. We also see that there is more and more people, companies, governments around the world saying that they're acting on climate. But at least to date, we can see that since the formation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Conference of the Parties, or COP as it's called, where we just had COP27 in Egypt. So since 1990, global emissions have increased by 60%, at a time where they said that they were looking to reduce emissions to zero. And over the same
So we got stuck, I think. Yeah, we have a technical problem, of course. Now Nick is gonna reconnect.
At the moment.
Yes, Nick, we lost you for just 10 seconds. So just
sorry.
No problem.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep. The last point was just that we'd emitted more than 50% of all historical emissions in the last 3 decades. And so when we speak about climate action, it's clear that we're still walking in the wrong direction or running in the wrong direction. But what we're ultimately working towards with sustainability, be it degrowth, green growth, or otherwise, is a good life for all. And what this means is that in order to have a high number of social thresholds met, which Kate Raworth talks about in Donut Economics, such as the right to education or the right to vote or the access to healthcare, should be coupled with very low environmental impact, what we call biophysical boundaries or planetary boundaries, as researched by the Stockholm Resilience Center. So combining these two, we should have a high amount of social thresholds and low biophysical boundaries transgressed, which would mean that we would be aiming to be in the top left corner of this graph right now, which we can see not many countries are in that area at all, and the closest one would be Costa Rica. And I had asked my parents before giving this talk tonight, if you were to name me the top 3 countries in the world as to their environmental indicators, what would they be? And they said, oh, I don't really know, but I guess I would pick a European country like Sweden or Denmark. But what we can see with these countries is that they do have a high quality of life, but it comes at the expense of the environment. And that is the biggest problem right now. And this is from one of a paper in Nature most recently. But the biggest question is, what is degrowth? As one of my friends, Tim Parikh, had researched a lot in his PhD thesis, what we find is that degrowth is a multi-purpose word. It can be used as an umbrella term for a variety of different social movements. It can be a provocation term that you throw in a conversation, and then all of the conversation now focuses on the issue of growth and problematizing growth, and is it a problem or not, and what aspects of growth are problematic. It can also be understood as combining activism and science again, which has fallen by the wayside previously. Or as Georgios Kallis says, one of the leading thinkers on degrowth, is that degrowth can be a network of ideas that otherwise get pushed underneath the carpet from a lot of green growth or current political matters. Another is that way to conceptualize degrowth was from Sergei Latouche, who is a political economist from France. And in 2009, he kind of said that degrowth should encapsulate these 9 different points, with the higher the number being the higher order change in society, such as reevaluating or rethinking our societal values, moving from competition to cooperation and from work to leisure, and that we need to reconceptualize different concepts such as wealth, poverty, scarcity, and abundance, and that this will ultimately need a restructuring of our productive apparatuses and social relations in society. And for degrowth, this really means that we need to redistribute a lot of wealth, property, and resources and energy use within and between countries. And we need to relocalize our production, consumption, and democracies. And which kind of extends to 6, 7, and 8, which we've probably heard about a lot in mainstream media when it comes to environmental matters, that we need to reduce, reuse, and recycle our goods. But since we need system transformation in order to achieve sustainability, it is these higher order reevaluate, reconceptualize, and restructure that becomes really important when we speak about social ecological transformation. And more recently, this was a graphic also initially made by Tim Parikh, is that degrowth is a multi-purpose word or multifaceted in the sense that it combines degrowth as a decline of resource use or environmental impact, which is what a lot of initial papers about degrowth were writing from that perspective. But now we've seen that degrowth also needs to be an emancipation from undesired ideologies such as capitalism and colonialism and productivism and utilitarianism and the way that we see the world. And more kind of critiques and also interest in the degrowth community is that degrowth should operate as a destination or something to aspire to, and that the values that we should be aspiring to are things such as care and justice and well-being and local democracies and frugality. So we can't see degrowth as picking one of these. It has to be all of these together, and this is what makes degrowth powerful per se. And most recently in their book, The Future is Degrowth, by Matthias Schmelzer, Andreas Vedder, and Aaron Vasnijan, was that growth is a social, ideological, and material process, and that the power of degrowth is that it combines critiques of growth that are otherwise usually separated, such as ecological critiques, feminist, anti-development, etc., and that it uses these critiques to then build a vision of what the future should look like, in the sense that it needs to be sufficient oriented, it needs to be grounded in feminist values, it needs to be grounded in the commons, and that there are many different strategies or ways to get there, which is what we will talk about in the latter half of the presentation. We can either radically reform existing institutions through policy proposals. We can create nowtopias, which is like living the world that you would like to see in the future. And we also need to build people power, or another concept that I was discussing with my parents before the lecture of like, what is a hegemony, which we won't have time to get into, but an interesting question nonetheless, if you are looking to bring people to gain interest through degrowth. The next question is, where is degrowth research? And this also, a lot of these slides stem from the results of the paper that I will discuss later, because my review was of every single book, article, book chapter, or a student thesis, be it bachelor, master, or PhD level, and what it discussed around degrowth. So I know that there is more than 1,000 peer-reviewed articles. There's 12 special issues on degrowth. There's around 30 books, 40 book chapters, and 100 student theses. That seems to multiply every year. There is a number of online seminars and lectures like this one. hosted today, and there's international conferences and summer schools around degrowth, and hundreds of different solidarity networks around the world popping up. But in terms of academic literature, most of the degrowth research we can see stems from Europe. Now, this map doesn't, each star doesn't represent one publication, or, there's only 1 or 2 publications in Australia which receives the same size star as England, which has 50 publications on degrowth. But it's more just to give you an idea of where in the world people are writing about degrowth at this point in time. And the concept of degrowth has kind of evolved since the early 2000s, with the top above the thick line being key publications that I found in my evolution of degrowth thinking. And on the bottom was the different international conferences for degrowth that usually happen every 2 years, with the next one being in Zagreb in Croatia in July, if you're interested to join. And the 2024 one will be in Vigo, which is in northwest Spain, for those not in Europe. And degrowth is also making headwaves into the IPCC reports, where we've seen earlier this year, they published their climate impacts, adaptation and vulnerability report, which was, almost 3,700 pages. And there was only 15 mentions of degrowth. But from this, we can see that degrowth is offered as an alternative vision to sustainability, away from green growth. It can also be an alternative vision for development, as well as looking into the different strategies of degrowth to achieve sustainability. And as I said before, there's a number of books, and if you find interest on different topics, you're more than welcome to check them out. The one that, if you're looking for a complete summary of all the latest degrowth research, I'd suggest The Future is Degrowth. But if there are more specific topics that you're interested in, then there's plenty available. But the meat of this topic today is how to organize for degrowth, which is the main part of my PhD thesis. And I kind of see it as 3 main pillars, being collective destruction, which is what I see as direct action from civil society against fossil capital and the elites; radical reformism, in the sense that changes within existing institutions that keep the goal of social emancipation, and is the main focus of this talk, given that it is more oriented towards people that are interested in policy, whilst sitting in the tension that a lot of degrowth scholars and history of social history see change in society doesn't usually come from policymakers, and that the state can be either a force for good or a force for evil. And then the last one is co-creating alternatives, in the sense that there are many institutions that are beyond repair, and we need to create new institutions that are grounded in care, conviviality, and sufficiency beyond present ones. So that is praxis, or practice, as I like to call it. So the first one being collective destruction, there was a recent really good paper that I enjoyed from Benjamin Sovacool and Alexander Dunlop. They come from a more eco-anarchist perspective. Not that they tend to agree with it themselves, but it's a serious question that those interested in sustainability should ask themselves. So what radical tactics might those seeking transformation action on climate or environmental sustainability be willing to undertake? And what options are capable of stopping actors or institutions who already are very powerful and are not willing to give that up? But a few examples of this could be, protesting coal mines in Germany and shutting down the machinery for a couple of days. It could be, jamming the stalls in public transportation so that public transport is free, to oppose government deregulation of public transport, for example, or divestment movements, or strike for climate. There are a multiple of different ways. The second being co-creating alternatives, is that there are a number of different networks that are not necessarily explicitly degrowth per se, like the Global Eco Village Network or La Via Campesina, but for degrowth, they kind of embody the change that we want to see in the world. And this is how you build alliances between different social networks. It's not that degrowth itself wants every other social movement to say, yes, we are in favor of degrowth, and now we will, say degrowth in our speeches, in our policy briefs, and in our actions. It's that there are a number of different ways to achieve sustainability, and that those with similar values should align themselves while sitting in the tensions of how different they are and the modes in which they like to achieve transformation or sustainability. But the main part of the last 10 minutes or so before we open it up to questions was around radical reformism, stemming from the paper that I mentioned previously. So the paper that I did identified 530 degrowth policy proposals, and we split that down into the sense that there are 50 overarching goals for degrowth policy proposals. And within that, there's 100 objectives and 380 different instruments to achieve the objectives and goals, which I'll go through in a second. So that it also kind of debunked the critique that degrowth does not have any policy proposals, and it's not like fit for purpose in terms of social ecological transformations. So the purpose of the article was mainly to build a clear and detailed inventory of degrowth policy proposals. And we kind of looked at the current status of policy proposals between the co-authors, Tim Parikh and Inish Cosme, both who had worked on their PhDs on degrowth policy proposals. So it was great that we were able to combine all three of us in this paper and have the build upon previous works. And the second was, how did the key features of these policies fit the context of current policy, current public policy design and transition strategies, whether that be in government or in different organizations. And the method that I used for the paper was called ROSES, or Reporting Standards for Systematic Evidence Synthesis. Basically, the idea that if you want to call it a systematic evidence, a systematic review, that you need to be able to follow a certain process, and all of the process needs to be transparent and downloadable and could be replicated by somebody else. So as you can see in my paper, you could click the link and download all the Excels, and you can see why I included certain articles or why I excluded them, and the exact code or paragraphs that I highlighted and chose to pick out and highlight in my review. So the review contained around 1,200 texts, 90% of which were written in English, even though I had searched 16 translations of degrowth in various different languages. Most of the 80% of the papers were written in Europe. So that could be an Australian living in Amsterdam writing a paper about degrowth. But that's where most of the research funding seems to stem from, and that we like to write in a couple of different journals like Cleaner Production and Ecological Economics, and that most people writing about degrowth usually write as a single author on their paper, which kind of suggests that within our own academic departments, we're heavily outnumbered of people working on neoclassical economics, for example, compared to ecological economics or degrowth or political ecology. So the thematic synthesis aspect of the review was that once I pulled out all of the policy proposals, I then lumped them into different categories, and that they came up as the themes of the review. So there were 13 of them: culture and education, energy and environment, finance, food, geopolitics, indicators, inequality, production to consumption, science and technology, tourism, trade, urban planning, and work. And on the right-hand side of this slide is the main figure for the paper. It was kind of a testimony to the Gibson-Graham iceberg model, but adapted to degrowth. So above the surface is the 10 most popular policy instruments for degrowth. So universal basic incomes, work time reductions, job guarantees with living wages, maximum wealth and income gaps, even though that's a slight error there, deliberative forums, not-for-profit cooperatives, declining caps on resource use and emissions, reclaiming the commons, eco-villages, and housing cooperatives. And on the bottom, underneath the water, is the 50 overarching goals for degrowth policy proposals, which you can read in your own time. But I just wanted to break down each of the different 13 categories quickly as to what the overarching theme were and what the goals were, and then the objectives. And then we can have some questions maybe about what were the different instruments used behind each of them. So culture and education, for example, the goals that I identified through other people's literature, being a systematic review, were that we want the goal of critical education. But how do we achieve that? We achieve that through promoting emancipatory education and opposing economic determinism and ethnocentrism. And then further along the queue is like, how do you oppose economic determinism and ethnocentrism within, high schools, primary schools, or universities? And that's where we start to come into the instrument part of degrowth policy proposals, which at least my review highlighted that this is quite vague at the moment, and one of the things that degrowth needs to strengthen. But at least, having goals and objectives is really important for the degrowth movement itself, and identifying, the interactions between a lot of these different policy proposals. The next was energy and environment, which was probably the biggest theme, given that a lot of degrowth literature stems from ecological economics or feminist economics or political ecology related to the environment. Things like diminishing caps on resource use, or ecological tax reform, or moratoriums on resource extraction, stopping fossil fuels, and creating energy democracies where we ensure like convivial and community-owned renewable systems, as opposed to having the same fossil system, but just with renewable energies, at least ownership-wise. And as you can see, the energy and environment one is quite big, related to stopping nuclear energy, etc. The next was finance, which is short and sweet, related to financial democracy and ethical and non-speculative finance. And although it was a short topic, it is, a major focus for a lot of critique towards degrowth around finance. Like, how do we democratize and decentralize money? And how do we create tax justice? And why is that inherently linked to social ecological justice, for example? Food, we focused on, sustainable farming practices, such as institutionalizing subsistence organic farming or promoting small-scale farming. Food sovereignty, developing networks and cooperatives, promoting seed sharing, rebuilding soil fertility, and redistributing land to peasants and or the landless, and sustainable diets, kind of like normalizing slow food philosophies, reducing meat and dairy consumption. Governance and geopolitics is also an interesting one. The first being radical ecological democracy, which maybe you've heard Ashish Katari or Viviana Osada talking about the concept of a radical ecological democracy, in the sense that we need to decentralize decision-making and have local ownership of public services and resources. Indicators is another main one for degrowth, abolishing GDP as a measure of progress for society, and adopting a sway of social ecological indicators that more reflects the reality or the real world. Reducing inequality, in the sense that current levels of inequality within and between countries is an inhibitor to sustainability transformations, so that we need to reduce this either by redistributing land, labor, capital, and resources, as well as guaranteeing the universal provisioning of fundamental human needs. And another interesting one that I wasn't aware of prior to this review was the idea of transformative justice, alternatives to incarceration, or looking at a more nurturing and caring approach for the justice system itself. Production and consumption was another big one, related to what is socially useful production, achieving this via worker-owned production systems, or dismantling large corporations if they decide not to pay their tax or they're too ecologically destructive. Having direct not-for-profit models that don't focus on capital accumulation, which means smaller business size and looking at more commons-based productive activities. Relocalizing economic activities, limiting advertising. Different instances, this can either be through regulation, banning or taxing advertising, focusing on lifestyles of sufficiency and reducing waste. Simple things such as like banning planned obsolescence, even though it is obviously a very complex topic, it's like there should be no creation of technology that then dies within 2 years and forces you to create it, to buy a new one just for the sake of a profit-oriented model that pays out to shareholders. Science and technology, that it needs to have a focus on technological sovereignty, which means that we kind of really need to reassess the role of technology and what kind of technology we want in society. We need to have more activist-led science. We need to reduce patents, which we obviously seen during the COVID-19 crisis, even though it was, it existed prior to this, in the sense that rich European or American companies hold patents on technologies and refuse to give them out to the benefit of the entire world unless they can make $1 or $3 out of it prior to doing so. Convivial tools, such as, a bicycle, for example, is a very convivial tool. You can fix it yourself. You can ride it anywhere you want. You become more fitter, it's healthier for you, and you get your daily exercise. Tourism was another one that I wasn't that familiar with prior to doing the review, in the sense that we really need to limit and rethink tourism around fossil-based travel, especially high carbon and high distance, such as flying, or especially around getting private jets, for example, in the sense that 80% of people have never and probably will never fly in a plane in their life. And of the 20% of people that do fly in a plane, 50% of those emissions come from the top 1%. So it's the most unequal mode of transport possible. And ways around that needs to be thought about really quickly. And there was nothing more pertinent than the COP27, when there's, hundreds of private jets flying into climate negotiations that doesn't really look that good, and can be captured by either the left or the right in their opposal to climate action. Trade as well, which is an obviously huge one. We need to limit long distance and rethink, trade agreements and intellectual property rights. Urban planning, which is a big focus of degrowth, given that it's, it can operate in a very localized setting. We need to have sufficient housing sufficiency, just mobility. We need to, promote modal shifts away from flying and driving a car to walking, cycling, and all types of public transport. We need land justice. We need to restrict the commodification of property, or increase social housing, or guarantee housing without commodifying it at all in the first place. Because then you kind of ration resources on the ability to pay and how much money you have. And if you don't have money, then it's kind of seen as if you're not worth having those resources, which isn't the way that we should see the world, and shouldn't be how that we consider what it is to be human. So, and the last one was socially useful and ecologically sensitive planning. And then the final category, or a theme that we had, which is the last slide, by the way, Federico, is related to work. Another huge topic related to degrowth, and probably the second biggest theme of all of them, that we really need to reconceptualize work, reducing our time in paid labor, reallocating productivity gains in society to working less, and job creation, changing what is considered full-time right now, which is around 37 hours, give or take which country you're in, to 20 hours or 10 hours or 3 days per week, or 2 days per week, and then the other 3 days you help transform your local community into an eco village, for example. solidifying rights to part-time and self-defined work, and also still having the goal of low unemployment, but guaranteeing this with a living wage and through job sharing efforts, and redistributing our like reproductive activities, once again linked to land, like restricting the commodification of property and increasing social housing, and restoring our already degraded ecosystems through the creation of social ecological jobs by proactively retraining and procurement programs for people. So that was mainly the key takeaways of the huge review that took me over a year to complete, that most degrowth policy proposals are vague and not operational for decision makers. Some policies are more popular than others, like a universal basic income, compared to, you know, how do we defund military systems around the world? Visibility, that system thinking needs to be more required to unpack a lot of policy proposals. Like it's well and good to propose that we tax wealth, but then how do we actually tax wealth? What counts and what doesn't? And, you know, what kind of other changes needs to happen if we are to tax wealth? You might need to change the constitution in some countries to do this, which creates a hurdle. Not that that means that we should give up, but just things that we should consider. That degrowth is all the time creating new alliances and thinkers and practitioners, and that we need to think, how do all these proposals fit together? So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. I have to say, every session of this seminar seems to open up more complexity within this degrowth universe. But I think it was very useful to put it down and to show that there is actually concrete directions. Yes, some may lack some concreteness, as you say, but might be not so operational. But I think there is a lot there to work on. And I already see there are many questions. Let me start with one that links to your last slide about the popularity of some proposals rather than others. So can you give us more info on this? What did you find out about the popularity? So which one are more popular among policymakers, for example, than others?
Sorry. Yeah, that's a good question. At least what I noticed in my research was that the 10 policies that I mentioned, like universal basic income, work time reductions, job guarantees, maximum income and wealth caps, they're the most popular, like degrowth policy proposals per se. But the interesting part that I found, that at least through universal basic incomes, was that a lot of people in degrowth would just fleetingly mention a UBI. And then, like, if I'm completing my review, then I kind of need to, you know, count all the papers that refer to a UBI. And so a lot of them would be referring to some foundational papers about a universal basic income. And so maybe it is the most popular policy and maybe it isn't the most popular policy. Are people just mentioning it because other people that are more reputable in the, or, you know, more highly cited in degrowth literature speaking about a universal basic income, which then skews the you know, discourse towards UBIs, as opposed to discussing how do we defund militaries, because they're the usually the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, like in a country of organizations, for example.
I mean, one other question related to it is about political parties. I mean, when I see this overview, some proposals are already in the agenda of some political parties. So do you see this as, you know, what is the share in your view of this proposal that are already somehow in a propositional state, like, you know, within party politics? And which one are instead completely alien to party politics at the moment, in your view?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. Geez, the most like party politics that I'm familiar with is like Denmark and Australian context, because I've lived in them for a number of years. But at least the ones that are not on the agenda is like, you know, declining caps on resource use, or any any talk of redistributing resources in society, whether that be land, money, or wealth, there is kind of a common sense that once you acquire something, whether it be land or money, that it is yours forever and you've like somehow earned the right to it. And so this is kind of really off the table, and people don't see the extreme levels of inequality within and between countries as like a fundamental inhibitor to sustainability transformations, which I think is problematic. There are some parties that would see it, whereas other policies like a UBI or work time reductions are starting to be discussed in Scandinavia, and they're running some trials on 30-hour work weeks because they find that people, but it's still around productivity. It's like they've found that you can still get all the same jobs you've done in 40 hours done in 30 hours, and you're kind of happier, and it's a win-win. So it was also a question from my parents, like, where is degrowth policy proposals being implemented? And I said, oh, well, there's some here and some here, but it's, it's one policy out of, a whole swathe of policies that are very growth and export oriented, which, makes it really hard to decipher this.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is that each or many of these policy proposals could be somehow co-opted within a green growth agenda. So there is a risk that if we take one out of context, then we put it in service of a green growth agenda. And I can see that happening indeed. And so basically you're suggesting to look at it more like indeed the interaction between them. So like you can't get one if you don't get more than those together, and in order to get it right, or something like this. Do I understand correctly?
Yeah, exactly. You can't have one without the other. And that, the interactions is the most important part, or that, stepping away from the compartmentalization, which we see in governance and geopolitics. It's like, okay, finance ministry is going to discuss the budget over here, and they're in charge of all the money. And then the environment ministry is, full of, greenies that want to preserve the environment, and we'll just keep them separate over here. And it's the finance department who has like ultimate power, finance ministry, over all the other ministries, which really determines what kind of policies you're chasing in a government or political party or big organization, which is also the same. And it's the failure to see that all of these are tightly interconnected and dependent upon one another, which is why interactions become so important to like study and to see things from a systems perspective.
Yeah. And what do you think would be the scale, the right scale to start? I mean, in terms of regional, local, international, global.
Yep. I think it's, if you want something like concrete, it will always come from where you live and the like social relations that you have. This is where you develop the deepest connection to like the places that you live, and the people that you meet. And it's also where you can do something concrete now and feel the measurable impact of that. Not that to say that it will be easy, and not to glorify or romanticize local politics and that it, everything just falls into place. But we can see, at least from like international and national negotiations on climate, that there is, a real lack of appetite to reduce material and energy throughput, especially from high income countries who would have to drastically change their mode of living per se.
Yeah, there's one common question in the chat, in fact, about whether it would be basically strategic to start from high income countries where the well-being index is stagnating, where people are dissatisfied with their wealth to a certain degree. Countries like indeed the one where we live here, like countries where maybe there is more potential also to disrupt. Is that would be a strategy in your view, you think, to start there?
I mean, I think it's a bit hard to suggest otherwise, because I've never lived in not in a high income country per se. I've only lived in Australia and Denmark. But I think it is obvious that in these countries or instances that inequality is so high and people are frustrated. And unfortunately, it is the right that is more taken advantage of this, or vented their frustration and gained the interest of like the working class, whereas the left has kind of missed out up until now and has some small gains and this kind of thing. But in the same sense, I also see from like struggles around the world that it is the working class and the people of projects that are implemented for the benefit of people that live in high income countries, but the impact is in low to medium income countries. They're the people that constantly struggle for climate justice day in, day out. And we don't see this. You would never see it in mainstream media. You don't really hear about it. And it's understandable that people can't somehow connect this to their everyday life, because most people live largely detached from this, and they only see the final product or the end built runway of their plane.
I think just to pick up on one thing you said about the everyday life. I mean, you mentioned the concept of hegemony at the beginning of your talk, and it seems to me that really there is really the challenge is right there. Is basically finding a narrative that makes people understand that growth is not good for them in their everyday life. Because now the hegemony of growth is exactly that, is that we have been convinced, all of us have been convinced that the interest of the few is good for all of us to a certain degree. And without those few, actually we'll all suffer, we'll all be, in recession and things like this. So you see so many policy proposals, and what is the challenge of this narrative building? I mean, is there a possibility to build a narrative around so many policy proposals, or should we shrink it a bit more, focus on some? What could be the best way to tackle this issue?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that I was also discussing with my parents. And at least I think that social movements in history have usually like created change of a very like simple message, much like political parties today, that gains the interest of like the working class or people that are aligned with whatever values they're trying to change: feminist values, ecological values, social working class values, disability rights, ableism, ageism, etc., etc. And then it's the pushback from like governments or corporations that want to accumulate capital, disproportionate kind of response that then evokes more interest from other people because they can see that injustice. And so I would say it does make a lot of sense to kind of like streamline it and have a few very simple messages that Degrowth wishes to or envisions to see in the world, and to align themselves with a lot of different other organizations that are advocating for very similar policy proposals or transformation opportunities for transformation.
Yeah, we are brainstorming on this because it is indeed also the challenge for movements in general. What is the right story in this sense? And I think the concept of degrowth on the one hand offers a lot of material to build this story. On the other hand, some people maybe feel pulled off from it. Not me, not you, but many suggest indeed that it's not a propositional concept. It's about doing something less. It's not about doing more of something else. So it is probably the key challenge. There's also, I mean, I'm just commenting this, but just to lead to another question. Somebody on the chat asks, what would be the next step of research? So we know, you just show that we know so much, we have so many policy proposals. What do we miss still? What is the key challenge for research and knowledge on this now, in your view?
Yeah, that's I can just give away my whole PhD thesis and someone else can write it. That'd be great. No, in terms of policy, I think it's somehow related to studying the interactions between different policies and looking at budgets on different levels, whether that be like local, municipal, regional, or national budget levels, and see where the current funding or money goes and how it would be otherwise in a degrowth society. And where are there instances of where this has been tried, such as like participatory budgeting in Alegre in Brazil. And participatory budgeting, for those not familiar with it, is like you take an area and you get a specific public budget for the year, and instead of, you know, representative democracy and you're a candidate and they're a party identifying how that they should spend the money, that it should go all the way down to the local level, and that you should hold a series of deliberative forums or workshops, and people should then deliberate on how their local funding is used for that year. And then you would do it again for the next year. And at least from the initial results of this is that people tend not to focus on a lot of these economic and growth jobs kind of like budgeting ways, and they tend to focus more on the things that they need in their life to reproduce themselves, like social housing or healthcare or education or things that should be decommodified, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's intriguing now that you bring in the financial aspects in. Indeed, could it be basically just, I mean, it seems like maybe everything starts from this problem. We need to tax excess and get money from there in order to pay for all the good stuff we miss. It seems like, to me, one of the somehow the most obvious things to do, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a great starting point, because it's like there are such obscene amounts of wealth and income that most people can't even fathom, and that everybody like would or should be on board for, such as like banning private jets. Like, does anyone know anyone with a private jet? and like and if you do, you probably shouldn't, or you should tell them that like they shouldn't have one. Or, you know, rather than these like really other, you know, contentious issues that tend to divide people, there are easily obscene amounts of wealth that could be redistributed, that 99.9% of the population would and should support. And these are the ones that like Degrowth and anyone interested in sustainability more broadly should be advocating for, whether it be through an income and wealth tax, for example, which most countries have actually slowly eroded over time and don't have them anymore, because, you know, we've been sold the common sense of the American or the Australian dream, where you have a quarter-acre block, a picket fence, you have a car, a dog, you know, a happy family with 2 kids, blah blah blah, and so you don't, oh, and I might become a millionaire, so, you know, I don't want high tax on millionaires because maybe one day I'll make it, where in fact the results of that is not true at all.
Yeah, here you see the hegemony again, the idea that you know, wealth exists because it's a destination that is potentially reachable by all of us, and yeah, I think this creates this. It's a mental pattern that we need to break somehow. And yeah, another question about the movement, your experience with the degrowth. Let's say degrowth movements. There are many that are attached to this term. You showed this 3 different concepts of destruction, reform, and experimentation, or let's say practice or prefiguration, in my own words. How do these 3 practices coexist, in your view, within the degrowth movement, or there are conflicts between them?
Yeah, that's a really great question, actually. And I would love to have some long, in-depth discussions about it. But in my opinion, I think in some ways, radical reformism, given that it operates in a space where there is so much power, either through governments or corporations and lobbying interests, that it actually has the potential to be co-opted and protect the status quo, as opposed to be radical, in the sense that it could be watered down and actually operate in the opposite way that degrowth intends it to be. And that, whereas the other one, like direct action or collective destruction or whatever I called it, you know, fossil capital and people with obscene amount of wealth, millionaires and billionaires, would always oppose and would never like actively support, and you can't really like water it down somehow. And then co-creating alternative institutions I see as kind of more similar to collective destruction, in the sense that, like, you know, people obviously want to build down and tear something different, tear something down and build something different, and that this is not necessarily going to be easy, and people shouldn't romanticize and think that it will be. But at the same time, that's what is so important about experimenting, that we don't really have many spaces in society where you can experiment with things like building an organization or a social movement, you know, making a mistake and learning from it and changing your angle, because you usually just get, you know, absolutely crucified for making the mistake, and, you know, that you're not perfect anymore, because there is a sense of like perfectionism embedded within our culture that has inherent links to like white supremacy and this kind of thing. So I think creating these spaces where you can experiment with people around you, whether that be, you know, creating a journal that is not for profit and has no money oriented towards it, like me and a few friends are doing with the Degrowth journal, or it's like establishing an eco village in Portugal, and learning how to grow like vegetables together and this kind of stuff. It's obvious that you're not going to have like food sovereignty in 6 months, but it's like learning those skills to become resilient and thinking about collective minded decisions together is important, I think.
Yeah, so in fact, indeed, it is a synergy of the 3 steps after all. And I have to say, in my experience, what I see is that the collective destruction or interruption of, let's call it this way as well, and the prefiguration, so the practice, often they are connected. So many activists of Extinction Rebellion, Scientists for Future, they practice what they preach to a certain degree. What we miss sometimes is also, the connection with the institutional politics. So basically, the radical reformist, there are few parties, few politicians that are, you know, speaking to this movement somehow, because I have a feeling, but maybe that's one of the reasons there where it's not working yet at the speed necessary at least. Anyway, this was just a reflection. We are at 2:00 now. It must be very late where you are now. So I really would like to thank you a lot, Nick, for your time, for being with us here. It was really inspiring, and I think it's really a very good material for the discussion we will have about degrowth in the Netherlands the 8th of December. Thank you very much. For the audience, just again, the 8th of December at 8:00 this time, so in the evening, we will have a panel. We'll have 3 speakers. We'll have Paul Skenderling, which many of you know, author of the book Er is leven na groei. Felix van Often, also a degrowth thinker in the Netherlands. De Golfen and de Kaap, it's the book he wrote. And then we'll have Faiza Hulassen, I hope I pronounce well the surname, from Greenpeace, Netherlands, and Extinction Rebellion. So we will have a discussion with them. There will be no presentation, but will be more indeed a panel. So very welcome to come live and pose your questions. You can watch again this session on YouTube channel, the usual. And I thank again also Leo and Fabian for organizing this. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for organizing, Federico.
Thank you,
And
Nick.
thanks for everyone for joining.